You'd be fired before breakfast, not because you're lazy or incompetent, but because you'd commit the unforgivable sin of making eye contact with your employer while serving their morning tea. That's it. That's all it would take. One accidental glance, one moment of treating them like a fellow human being instead of a deity, and you'd be out on the street faster than you could say terribly sorry, my lord. Victorian domestic service wasn't a job. It was psychological warfare disguised as employment. The upper classes had spent generations perfecting a system of human degradation so thorough that it makes modern workplace harassment look like a gentle massage. If you're ready to discover just how soft modern life has made you, smash that like button and subscribe, because we're about to take you on a journey that'll make you kiss your boring office job. Trust me, you'll never complain about your boss again. Picture yourself transported back to 1880 London. You're desperate for work, and someone mentions a position at a grand townhouse. Good wages, they say. Respectable family, they promise. What they don't mention is that you'll be working 18-hour days under more rules than a military prison during wartime. You think you could handle it? You've worked customer service. You've dealt with difficult bosses. How hard could it be to dust some furniture and serve some tea? You sweet, naive fool. The Victorian servant's life was specifically designed to break people like you, people with opinions, people who expected basic human dignity, people who thought they deserved to be treated like actual humans instead of extremely expensive furniture that occasionally needed feeding. Every aspect of your existence would be controlled, monitored, and criticized. Your posture while walking, the volume of your breathing, the direction of your gaze, all subject to instant judgment and potential termination. And the most brilliantly twisted part, you'd be grateful for this treatment. Because in Victorian England, being psychologically destroyed on a daily basis was actually considered one of the better career options available to the working class. So let's start with part 1, where you'll discover why you'd never even get hired in the first place. The job interview alone would destroy you completely. 1. You'd fail the interview before it even started. You're standing outside a grand London townhouse, clutching your carefully forged letter of recommendation. The brass knocker gleams like it's been polished by the tears of previous applicants. Your palms are sweating, which is unfortunate because sweating was considered deeply unseemly in polite Victorian society. Already, you're failing. The door opens, and you're faced with the housekeeper, a woman whose facial expression suggests she's personally offended by your very existence. Her eyes scan you from head to toe like a butcher evaluating a particularly disappointing cut of meat. You've got approximately 3 seconds to make a good impression, and you're about to waste all of them because you don't know how to curtsy properly. You think you do. You've seen it in movies. You do that little knee bend thing and maybe bob your head. Charming. Except Victorian curtsies were an art form, a complex dance of submission that communicated your exact social position, level of respect, and understanding of your place in the cosmic order. Get it wrong, and you might as well have walked in wearing muddy boots and a sandwich board reading "I don't belong here." The depth of your curtsy had to be precisely calculated, too shallow, and you're showing disrespect, too deep, and you're mocking the gesture. Your left foot goes slightly behind your right, your head tilts at exactly the right angle, your eyes lower but not too much, because looking at the floor shows you're shifty, but looking up shows you're impertinent. You'd probably do something horrifying like a theatrical stage bow or worse, attempt a handshake. The housekeeper's face would freeze in the kind of expression usually reserved for discovering something unpleasant on the bottom of one's shoe. But let's say you somehow nail the curtsy through sheer dumb luck. Now comes the walking test. Because yes, there was a walking test. Victorian servants were expected to move with a very specific gait, quick enough to show efficiency, quiet enough to avoid disturbing the family, and graceful enough to maintain the illusion that servants were mystical beings who glided rather than walked. Your modern walk probably a confident stride with your arms swinging freely, would be considered outrageously inappropriate. You'd stomp through that house like a drunken elephant, your footsteps echoing through the halls like gunshots. The way you naturally hold your shoulders, the casual swing of your arms, your habit of looking around with curiosity, all wrong, all offensive, all grounds for immediate dismissal. Victorian servants mastered the art of invisible movement. They'd perfected a silent shuffle that allowed them to cover ground quickly while making about as much noise as a whisper. Their posture was rigidly controlled, shoulders back but not proud, head held steady but eyes appropriately downcast, hands positioned in very specific ways depending on their role and the task at hand. You'd lumber through like you owned the place, which would be roughly as welcome as a cholera outbreak. Then comes the character reference check. Every servant position required impeccable references from previous employers, preferably clergy or other respectable members of society. These references had to vouch not just for your work ethic, but for your moral character, your temperance, your religious devotion, and your complete absence of any interesting personality traits. The problem, you don't have any legitimate Victorian references, so you'd need to forge them, which half the applicants did anyway. The trick was making them believable. A letter from Reverend James Goodhart of St. Bartholomew's Parish needed to sound authentically pompous and include the right religious platitudes about your steady character and devotion to Christian duty. Your modern resume skills wouldn't help here. Victorian employers didn't care about your education, your previous experience, or your personal goals. They wanted to know if you were morally pure, physically strong enough for 18-hour workdays, and mentally weak enough to accept complete subordination without complaint. The questions they'd ask would seem bizarre by today's standards. How often do you attend church? Do you drink alcohol? Have you ever been seen in the company of men without proper supervision? Do you have any family members who might cause scandal? Can you read? Actually, scratch that last one. Literacy was sometimes considered suspicious in a servant. Too much education might give you ideas above your station. Then came the practical demonstrations. You'd be asked to show your skills in basic tasks that you've probably never done in your life. Light a fire using only coal, paper, and kindling, no matches, because matches were expensive and servants were expected to use flint and steel like it was still the Middle Ages. Properly fold a gentleman's shirt so it wouldn't wrinkle. Set a formal table with 17 different pieces of silverware, each with its own specific purpose and placement. You'd stand there, staring at a collection of mysterious implements that looked like medieval torture devices, trying to remember which fork was for fish and which was for fowl, while the housekeeper watched your every move with the intensity of a hawk studying a particularly clumsy mouse. And then the rules. Oh, the glorious, mind-numbing rules. The housekeeper would begin listing them in a monotone voice that suggested she'd given this speech approximately 1,000 times before. Never speak unless spoken to. Never make eye contact with the family or their guests. Never use the front door. Never be seen in the upstairs areas unless specifically summoned. Never eat food meant for the family. Never sit down during working hours. Never ever express an opinion about anything. The list would go on for approximately 45 minutes. Rules about how to walk, how to stand, how to breathe quietly, how to dust clockwise instead of counterclockwise, because apparently the direction of your dusting motions could somehow offend the furniture. Rules about which stairs you could use and when. Rules about how to address different members of the household hierarchy. Rules about rules about rules. Your modern brain, accustomed to workplace protections and basic human dignity, would start short-circuiting around minute 15. By minute 30, you'd be questioning your life choices. By minute 40, you'd be wondering if starvation might actually be preferable to this psychological torture. But wait, there's more, because even if you somehow memorized all the rules, demonstrated adequate curtsying skills, and convinced them your forged references were legitimate, you'd still need to pass the final test showing the appropriate level of gratitude. Victorian employers expected their servants to be pathetically grateful for the privilege of being exploited. You needed to radiate humble appreciation for the opportunity to work 18-hour days for wages that barely covered basic survival. Any hint that you viewed this as a business transaction rather than a blessed charity would be deeply offensive. You'd be expected to practically weep with joy at the prospect of sleeping in an unheated attic and eating table scraps. Your face should light up with genuine excitement at the thought of waking up at 4 in the morning to light fires and scrub floors. The idea that you might have other aspirations or consider this a temporary arrangement would be seen as ungrateful impertinence. Modern people are terrible at fake gratitude for genuinely awful situations. You'd probably show your true feelings through micro-expressions, body language, or the simple fact that you weren't literally throwing yourself at their feet in appreciation. And even if you somehow passed all these tests, survived the interview and got hired, you'd quickly discover that the interview was actually the easy part, because the real nightmare was about to begin. The moment that door closed behind you and you were officially employed, you'd realize you'd just signed away your freedom, your dignity, and quite possibly your sanity. The rules you'd memorized were just the beginning. The real education in Victorian servant life was about to start, and it began bright and early the next morning. At 4 o'clock in the morning, every single day. But surely waking up early couldn't be that bad, could it? After all, lots of people wake up early for work. How much worse could it possibly be? 2. You'd quit on day 1, at 4 a.m. The bells start ringing at 4 in the morning. Not gentle chimes or pleasant melodies. Harsh, demanding clangs that slice through your dreams like a rusty knife through butter. You're lying in what generously could be called a bed, but more accurately resembles a wooden board with delusions of comfort, covered by a blanket so thin it's basically decorative. Your attic room is smaller than most modern closets, and roughly as welcoming as a tomb. The ceiling slopes so dramatically that standing upright is only possible in the exact center, assuming you're under 5 feet tall. The window, if you can call it that, is about the size of a postage stamp and provides a stunning view of absolutely nothing but soot-covered rooftops. But there's no time for architectural appreciation because those bells are still ringing, and every second you waste lying there is another mark against your character. Victorian households operated on military precision, and soldiers who overslept got court-martialed. Servants who overslept got something worse. They got lectured by the housekeeper. You scramble out of bed, your feet hitting the ice-cold floor with a shock that would wake the dead. There's no central heating in the servants' quarters because warmth was considered a luxury, and luxuries were for people who mattered. Your breath forms visible clouds in the frigid air as you fumble for your uniform in the darkness. Because of course there's no electric lighting up here. Candles cost money, and money spent on servant comfort was money wasted. You dress by feel, hoping you're putting everything on the right way around, because appearing disheveled downstairs would be grounds for immediate dismissal. 5 minutes. That's how long you have from the first bell to being downstairs, ready to work. 5 minutes to transform from unconscious human being to perfectly functioning domestic machine. Modern people need 5 minutes just to remember their own names in the morning, but Victorian servants were expected to achieve instant consciousness and perfect presentation faster than you can say industrial revolution. You stumble down the narrow servant's staircase, trying not to trip over your own feet, while maintaining the required silent footsteps. These stairs were designed by someone who clearly hated servants and wanted them to suffer. They're steep, narrow, unlit, and positioned at angles that seem to defy basic physics. One wrong step and you'd tumble down like a sack of particularly clumsy potatoes. The kitchen is already a hive of activity because apparently you weren't the only one subjected to this pre-dawn torture. The cook is already working, having been up since 3:30 to start the bread. The scullery maid looks like she hasn't slept in approximately 6 months. Everyone moves with the desperate efficiency of people who know that being even 30 seconds late means facing the wrath of management. Your first task? Light the fires, all of them. Throughout the entire house, before the family wakes up, every room must be perfectly warmed and ready for occupation. This means carrying coal, kindling, and various fire-starting equipment up and down those treacherous stairs multiple times while maintaining absolute silence. Coal is heavy. Coal is dirty. Coal is black dust on everything it touches, including you. By the time you've lit the third fireplace, you look like you've been wrestling with a chimney sweep and lost badly. But there's no time to clean yourself up because there are 17 more fireplaces to go, and the family will start stirring in approximately 2 hours. Each fire must be lit perfectly. Too small, and the room won't warm properly. Too large, and you're wasting expensive fuel. The technique requires precise placement of kindling, careful arrangement of coal, and the delicate art of coaxing flames from reluctant tinder without producing excessive smoke. You'd probably set the house on fire, not intentionally, but your modern fire starting skills likely extend to gas stove burners and maybe a barbecue grill on a good day. The Victorian art of fire management was a complex skill that took months to master and seconds to mess up catastrophically. But let's say you somehow manage the fires without committing accidental arson. Next comes water duty. Hot water doesn't magically appear from taps in 1880. It has to be heated, carried, and distributed throughout the house. Every basin, every washstand, every bathing facility requires fresh hot water delivered at precisely the right temperature. This means multiple trips up and down those stairs carrying heavy jugs of steaming water. Your arms would be screaming by trip number 3, but you've got approximately 15 more trips to go. And heaven help you if you spill even a drop on the carpet, because carpet stains were treated as personal attacks on the family's dignity. The water has to be the perfect temperature. Too hot, and you'd scald the delicate sensitivities of your employers. Too cold, and you'd be accused of laziness and disrespect. You had to judge temperature by touch, which meant regularly burning your fingers while testing water that could cook an egg. Modern people can't even get their shower temperature right with digital controls and immediate feedback. You'd be standing there, frantically dipping your hand into scalding water like some sort of masochistic thermometer, trying to achieve the impossible perfect temperature while precious minutes ticked away. Then comes the real fun, preparing breakfast. Not for yourself, obviously. Your breakfast consists of whatever scraps might be left over after everyone else has eaten, assuming there are any scraps, and assuming you have time to eat them. The family's breakfast, however, must be elaborate, perfectly timed, and served at exactly the right temperature. Victorian breakfasts weren't simple affairs. We're talking multiple courses, various meats, eggs prepared in different styles, fresh bread, preserves and beverages served in specific orders at precise intervals. Everything had to be coordinated so that hot dishes arrived hot, cold dishes arrived cold, and nothing sat around long enough to become lukewarm disappointment. You'd be running around the kitchen like a caffeinated squirrel, trying to juggle multiple cooking processes while the cook barked orders and criticized your every move. Modern people struggle to make toast without burning it, but you'd be expected to manage a full Victorian breakfast production line without missing a beat. And all of this happens before 7 in the morning, before most modern people have even considered getting out of bed. You've already completed what feels like a full day's work. Your back aches from carrying coal and water. Your hands are burned from testing water temperature. Your feet are frozen from running around on cold floors. Your clothes are dirty from coal dust and kitchen work. But the day hasn't started yet. This is just the warm-up act. Because at 7 o'clock, the family begins to wake up, and that's when your real duties begin. Everything you've done so far, the fires, the water, the breakfast preparation, was just setting the stage for the main performance. Now you have to actually interact with your employers while maintaining perfect invisibility, absolute silence, and complete competence. The morning routine alone would break most modern people. We're used to rolling out of bed, stumbling to the coffee machine, and gradually achieving consciousness over the course of an hour or two. Victorian servants were expected to achieve instant perfection and maintain it for the next 14 hours straight. No coffee breaks, no gradual warm-up period, no allowance for natural human limitations like fatigue, hunger, or the basic need to adjust to being awake. From the moment those bells rang at 4 in the morning, you were expected to function at peak efficiency until well past sundown. And if you yawned, if you showed any sign of being tired or human or affected by the brutal schedule, well, that would be considered a grave character flaw, because apparently needing sleep was a moral failing that could be corrected through proper discipline and regular humiliation. The Victorian work ethic was essentially sleep is for the weak and weakness is for people who don't deserve employment. Charming philosophy, really. Absolutely sustainable and definitely not designed to slowly kill people through exhaustion. But surely the work itself couldn't be that complicated. Could it? How hard could it be to respond when someone rang a bell? You'd just go see what they wanted and do it, right? Oh, you sweet summer child, you have no idea what's coming next. 3. You'd cry the first time the bell rang. The bell system in a Victorian household wasn't just a way to summon servants. It was a psychological weapon designed to ensure you never experienced a moment of peace for the rest of your natural life. Picture this. You're finally getting the hang of the morning routine. You've managed to light most of the fires without setting anything ablaze. You've carried water upstairs without drowning anyone. You're starting to think, maybe, just maybe, you might survive this job. Then you hear it. Dabbing. One single, innocent-sounding chime that might as well be the opening note of your funeral dirge. Victorian houses were equipped with elaborate bell systems that connected every room to the servants' quarters. Each room had its own bell, and each bell had its own distinct sound, pitch, and rhythm. The drawing room bell sounded different from the library bell. The master bedroom bell had a different tone than the guest bedroom bell. There were bells for the morning room, the dining room, the study, the conservatory, and approximately 17 other rooms whose purposes you'd never figure out. The kitchen had a bell board, a wooden panel with numbered indicators showing which room had rung. In theory, this should make things simple. Bell number 7 rings. You check the board, see it's the blue bedroom, and off you go. Easy, right? Wrong. Catastrophically, hilariously wrong. Because the bell system wasn't just about telling you where to go, it was about telling you everything. Who was calling, what they wanted, how urgent it was, what mood they were in, and exactly how quickly you needed to respond. All communicated through the magical language of bell ringing that you were somehow supposed to understand instinctively. 1 short ring meant come here when convenient. 2 short rings meant come here now. 3 short rings meant come here immediately or face consequences. 1 long ring followed by 2 short rings meant something completely different. A rapid series of short rings meant someone was having a tantrum, and you were about to get blamed for something you didn't do. Lady Pemberton had her own special bell-ringing style that allegedly communicated her specific needs. A gentle, measured ring meant she wanted tea. A sharp, impatient ring meant she wanted you to fix something that wasn't actually broken. A prolonged, aggressive ringing meant she was angry about something unrelated to you, but you were going to suffer for it anyway. The master of the house rang his bell with the authority of someone accustomed to instant obedience. His rings were short, sharp, and demanded immediate response. Miss Catherine, the eldest daughter, had a tendency to ring her bell repeatedly in quick succession because she'd never learned patience. Young Master Edward rang his bell like he was trying to break it, which probably reflected his general approach to life. You'd be standing in the kitchen trying to make sense of the cacophony of different bells ringing at different times in different patterns, while the other servants rushed around like ants whose nest had been disturbed. Everyone else seemed to understand this elaborate communication system instinctively, while you stood there looking like someone had just spoken to you in ancient Latin. "That's the morning room bell," the cook would say, not looking up from her pastry. "Lady Pemberton wants her tea service refreshed." But how could she possibly know that? It sounded exactly like every other bell to you, yet somehow, through years of Pavlovian conditioning, experienced servants had developed an almost supernatural ability to interpret bell language. The pressure was enormous. Got it wrong, show up in the wrong room, bring the wrong thing, or respond to the wrong person, and you'd be subjected to a lecture about your inattentiveness and poor listening skills. Because apparently not being able to telepathically understand complex messages communicated through bell ringing was a character flaw. And the bells never stopped. From 7 in the morning until well past 10 at night, bells rang constantly throughout the house. Sometimes multiple bells would ring simultaneously, creating a chaotic symphony that would make your head spin. You'd be running upstairs to answer the library bell when the drawing room bell would start ringing, followed immediately by the dining room bell. Each bell demanded immediate attention. There was no priority system, no way to politely ask one bell to wait while you answered another. Every ring was treated as equally urgent, equally important, and equally deserving of instant response. You'd spend your entire day running from room to room like a demented messenger service, never quite catching up with the demands, never quite understanding what was expected, never quite fast enough to satisfy the impossibly high standards of people who had nothing better to do than ring bells and complain about servants. The worst part? The bells weren't just about practical needs. Victorian employers used bells to assert dominance, to remind servants of their place, and sometimes just because they were bored. Lady Pemberton might ring her bell 6 times in an hour, each time requesting something that could have been combined into a single request if she'd possessed even a shred of consideration for your time and energy. But consideration was for equals, and servants weren't equals. Servants were barely considered human, which meant their time, energy, and sanity were completely disposable. You'd ring for fresh flowers, then ring again 5 minutes later because she decided she didn't like the arrangement. Ring for tea, then ring to complain that the tea was too hot. Ring to request a book from the library, then ring to have you return it because she'd changed her mind. Ring just to tell you that you'd walked too heavily on the stairs and disturbed her delicate sensibilities. Each ring meant dropping whatever you were doing and rushing to provide immediate service with a smile. You couldn't show frustration, couldn't suggest that maybe she could make all her requests at once, couldn't express any human emotion other than grateful eagerness to serve. Modern people would lose their minds within hours. We're used to reasonable requests made in reasonable ways at reasonable intervals. The idea of being constantly interrupted, constantly summoned, constantly required to drop everything and run somewhere else would drive us to distraction. And heaven help you if you didn't hear a bell. Victorian houses were large, and sounds didn't always carry clearly from room to room. If you were working in the basement and missed a bell from the 3rd floor, you'd be accused of deliberate disobedience. Because surely you weren't actually working. You must have been loafing around, ignoring your duties, showing disrespect for your betters. The bell system created a state of constant anxiety. You could never relax, never focus completely on one task, never experience a moment of peace. You lived in constant anticipation of that next ring, knowing it could come at any second and demand your immediate attention. Sleep became fitful because you'd trained yourself to listen for bells even while unconscious. Meals were interrupted constantly. Conversations with other servants were cut short. Your entire existence revolved around responding to the whims of people who had elevated inconsideration into an art form. You'd develop what modern psychologists would probably diagnose as hypervigilance disorder, constantly on edge, constantly listening, constantly ready to drop everything and run. Your nervous system would be permanently stuck in fight or flight mode, except you couldn't fight and you couldn't flee, so you'd just exist in a perpetual state of stressed out anticipation. And just when you thought you might be getting the hang of the bell system, just when you started to understand the difference between the breakfast room bell and the billiard room bell, disaster would strike in the form of guests. Because guests brought their own bells, their own demands, their own special requirements, and their own complete ignorance of how the household normally functioned. They'd ring bells at inappropriate times, make unreasonable requests, and generally turn your already chaotic existence into complete pandemonium. But that's a problem for later. Right now, you've got bigger concerns because those bells you've been rushing to answer. They're summoning you to navigate the most dangerous part of the house, the servant's staircase. And if you thought the bells were bad, wait until you try carrying a full tea service up 3 flights of narrow, unlit stairs while maintaining perfect silence and not spilling a single drop. Good luck with that. 4. You definitely trip and die on the servant's staircase. The servant's staircase was designed by someone who clearly viewed servant safety as an unnecessary luxury and servant convenience as a personal insult to the natural order of things. You're standing at the bottom of what can only be described as a vertical death trap, holding a fully loaded tea tray that weighs approximately as much as a small horse. The staircase stretches upward into darkness like something from a Victorian Gothic novel, except this isn't fiction. This is your daily reality, and you're about to discover that gravity is not your friend. These stairs weren't built for human beings. They were built for creatures with better balance than mountain goats, better night vision than owls, and apparently no sense of self-preservation whatsoever. The steps are narrow, uneven, and positioned at angles that seem to violate several laws of physics. The ceiling slopes downward at irregular intervals, creating perfect head-smashing opportunities for anyone taller than a particularly short child. There's no handrail because handrails were considered unnecessary extravagance for servant areas. There's no lighting because candles cost money, and servants were expected to develop supernatural night vision as part of their job requirements. The walls are bare stone or rough plaster that will scrape skin off anything that brushes against them. And you're expected to navigate this architectural nightmare while carrying trays loaded with delicate china, scalding hot liquids, and various breakable items that cost more than your annual salary, all while maintaining perfect silence, because making noise on the servant's stairs was considered deeply inappropriate and grounds for serious disciplinary action. The tea service you're holding contains approximately 17 different pieces, each more fragile than the last. There's a silver teapot filled with boiling water, delicate porcelain cups that would shatter if you looked at them wrong, sugar bowls, cream pitchers, and an assortment of small spoons that seem to exist solely to fall off trays at the worst possible moment. Victorian tea services were masterpieces of impractical design. Everything was engineered to be as breakable, as spillable, and as difficult to carry as possible. The handles were positioned at awkward angles. The spouts dripped. The saucers were too small for the cups. The milk pitchers had lips that guaranteed spillage. It was like someone had deliberately designed the most challenging possible load for someone navigating treacherous stairs in the dark. You take your first step and immediately realize you're doomed. The stair is higher than expected, deeper than it looks, and somehow manages to be both slippery and rough at the same time. Your foot searches for secure purchase, while the tray wobbles ominously in your hands. The teapot starts to slide. You overcorrect, which makes the sugar bowl shift toward the edge. You overcorrect again, which sends the cream pitcher on a slow-motion journey toward disaster. Every movement creates new instability, new opportunities for catastrophic failure, new ways for expensive china to become expensive powder. Modern people can barely carry a coffee cup up a well-lit staircase with proper handrails without spilling something. You're attempting to transport an entire formal tea service upstairs that would challenge a professional mountain climber, in darkness that would make a bat uncomfortable, while maintaining the kind of silence usually associated with ninja training. Step 2 is worse than step 1. The darkness seems to be getting thicker, if that's physically possible. You can't see where you're going, can't judge the height of the next step, can't tell if there's an obstacle ahead. You're navigating by feel, by instinct, and by increasingly desperate prayer to whatever deity protects clumsy servants from their own incompetence. The tray is getting heavier with each step. Your arms are starting to shake from the effort of keeping everything level and stable. The delicate balance you've achieved is becoming harder to maintain as fatigue sets in, and your muscles begin to protest this unreasonable demand for sustained precision. Somewhere around step 5, you make contact with the wall. Just a gentle brush of your shoulder against the rough plaster, but it's enough to disturb your carefully maintained equilibrium. The tray tilts slightly to the left. The teapot slides an inch toward the edge. Your heart rate doubles as you realize you're approximately 2 seconds away from complete disaster. You try to compensate by leaning away from the wall, which shifts your weight to the right, which makes the sugar bowl start its own slow-motion journey toward the abyss. You're now engaged in a complex dance of overcorrection and counter-overcorrection while climbing stairs in the dark with a tray full of fragile explosives. Step 8 brings a new challenge. An unexpected low ceiling beam positioned at exactly the right height to knock you unconscious if you stand up straight. You duck to avoid it, which changes your center of gravity, which affects the tray balance, which sends the cream pitcher into a gentle slide toward the edge of disaster. By step 10, you're sweating despite the cold, your hands are cramping from gripping the tray, your shoulders are burning from the constant tension, your legs are shaking from the combination of physical effort and sheer terror. You're beginning to understand why Victorian servants aged rapidly and died young. The darkness plays tricks on your mind. You can't tell if the next step is 1 inch away or 6 inches away. You can't judge whether you're leaning too far forward or too far back. Every step feels like a leap of faith into an abyss of potential humiliation and expensive breakage. And then it happens. Step 12 presents you with an uneven surface that your foot wasn't expecting. You stumble slightly, just enough to send the entire tea service into a gentle but inexorable slide toward complete catastrophe. Time slows down as you watch 17 pieces of expensive china begin their final journey. The teapot tilts majestically toward the edge. The sugar bowl performs a graceful pirouette. The delicate cups rattle against each other in what sounds like a porcelain death rattle. You make a desperate attempt to save the situation, which only makes it worse. Your overcorrection sends everything sliding in the opposite direction, creating a chain reaction of cascading disaster that would be almost beautiful if it weren't so expensive. The crash, when it comes, echoes through the entire house like a gunshot. 17 pieces of irreplaceable china explode against the stone steps in a symphony of destruction that seems to go on forever. The sound reverberates through the halls, announcing to everyone within a half-mile radius that you've just committed the ultimate servant sin. You've broken something valuable. The silence that follows is even worse than the crash. It's the kind of silence that precedes thunderstorms, volcanic eruptions, and employment termination. You stand there in the darkness, surrounded by the remains of what was once a beautiful tea service, knowing that your career as a Victorian servant has just ended with spectacular finality. But wait, it gets worse, because the sound of breaking china has summoned something far more terrifying than unemployment. It's summoned the housekeeper. You can hear her footsteps approaching, each one like a nail being hammered into your professional coffin. And as she rounds the corner, her face illuminated by the flickering candlelight, wearing an expression that suggests you've personally insulted her ancestry, you realize that breaking the tea service was actually the least of your problems. Because now you have to explain what happened to someone who has absolutely no patience for explanations, no tolerance for accidents, and no sympathy for servants who can't perform basic tasks like carrying things upstairs without destroying them. You thought the physical challenge of the stairs was difficult. Wait until you experience the psychological challenge of facing a Victorian housekeeper who's just discovered that you've turned 17 pieces of valuable china into approximately 17,000 pieces of expensive gravel. This conversation is going to be memorable. Unfortunately for you, 5. You'd be fired for making eye contact. Let's say you somehow survived the staircase incident without being immediately sacked or hospitalized. Maybe the gods of domestic service took pity on you, or perhaps Lady Pemberton was distracted by more pressing concerns, like whether the new wallpaper clashed with her delicate sensibilities. You're standing outside the morning room door, clutching a replacement tea tray with hands that are still trembling from your previous gravitational encounter. You've spent 10 minutes practicing your approach, mentally rehearsing each step, determined to execute this simple task without further catastrophe. You enter the room with what you hope resembles professional competence. Lady Pemberton is seated by the window, reviewing her correspondence with the focused intensity of someone who considers social invitations to be matters of national importance. You approach carefully, place the tea service on the designated table, and make the fatal error that destroys everything. You look at her face. Not deliberately, not disrespectfully. You're simply trying to gauge whether she's noticed your arrival, whether she has any specific requirements, whether she's paying attention to your presence at all. It's the most natural thing in the world. A basic human instinct to establish visual contact when interacting with another person. In Victorian servant etiquette, it's roughly equivalent to slapping her across the face while announcing your intention to steal her jewelry. Lady Pemberton's reaction is immediate and spectacular. Her face transforms from mild irritation to absolute horror, as if you've just committed an act so fundamentally offensive that it threatens the very foundations of civilized society. Her teacup freezes halfway to her lips. Her eyes widen in genuine shock. "How dare you look directly at me?" The words explode across the morning air like artillery fire. You immediately realize you've violated some crucial rule, but your modern brain struggles to process why making eye contact could possibly be considered offensive. After all, you're trying to provide good service. And good service usually requires paying attention to the person you're serving. Wrong. Catastrophically, hilariously wrong. Victorian social hierarchy was built on the fundamental principle that servants weren't people. They were mobile furniture with the inconvenient habit of having faces. Looking at your employer wasn't just rude, it was an assertion of equality that threatened the entire cosmic order. It suggested that you considered yourself worthy of the same basic human interaction that actual people might share. Absolutely unthinkable, completely inappropriate, grounds for immediate dismissal, and possibly public flogging. Lady Pemberton launches into a lecture that would make university professors weep with envy for its thoroughness and passion. She explains, with the patience usually reserved for teaching arithmetic to particularly slow children, that proper servants maintain their eyes in appropriate positions at all times. Down, but not sulking, focused on immediate tasks, but not ignoring surroundings, aware of what they're doing, but not presumptuous enough to make visual contact with their betters. It's like being asked to solve advanced calculus while juggling flaming torches, theoretically possible, practically impossible. The rules of Victorian servant eye contact were complex enough to require advanced degrees in social psychology. You could glance at objects you were handling, but not at the people handling them. You could observe your immediate work area, but not the broader room or its occupants. You could use peripheral vision for navigation, but direct visual contact was absolutely forbidden. You were expected to develop supernatural awareness of your employer's needs and moods without ever actually looking at them. It was like being asked to be psychic while maintaining the pretense that you barely possessed consciousness. The psychological effect was devastating. Eye contact is fundamental human communication, how we connect with others and assert our shared humanity. Removing it reduced servants to the status of well-trained animals, useful, occasionally requiring management, but not quite human enough to deserve recognition as individuals. You try to recover by fixing your gaze on the carpet. But Lady Pemberton has warmed to her subject. She's decided to transform this moment into a comprehensive education in proper servant behavior, delivered with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoys crushing other people's spirits. She critiques your posture. Too casual, your breathing. Too audible, your very existence seems to offend her delicate sensibilities. Standing there like a statue while she dissects every aspect of your physical presence, you begin to understand that being a Victorian servant required mastering the art of existing in quantum superposition, simultaneously present and invisible, efficient and unobtrusive, constantly available and completely ignorable. The lecture continues for approximately 15 minutes, covering topics from proper tea pouring technique to the appropriate way to hold your hands while standing at attention. Every aspect of your physical presence is examined, criticized, and corrected with military precision and aristocratic condescension. Modern people would be reduced to tears within minutes. We're not accustomed to having our every gesture monitored and critiqued by someone who considers our basic humanity presumptuous. The idea that looking at another person could be considered insubordination would strike us as genuinely insane. But in Victorian society, it made perfect sense. The entire system depended on maintaining clear distinctions between social classes, and those distinctions had to be reinforced through every possible interaction. Allowing servants to make eye contact would suggest they deserved the same basic respect afforded to human beings, which would undermine the fundamental assumptions that made domestic service possible. The psychological damage was cumulative and permanent. Servants learned to move through the world with downcast eyes, hunched shoulders, and body language that communicated complete acceptance of inferior status. They developed automatic deference responses that became as natural as breathing. You, with your modern egalitarian instincts and basic self-respect, would never adjust to this system. Every fiber of your being would rebel against treating another human as so inherently superior that looking at them was offensive. Your natural tendency to make eye contact during conversation would be considered grounds for immediate dismissal. The worst part, you'd probably keep making the same mistake. Modern habits are hard to break, especially when those habits involve basic human dignity. You'd catch yourself looking up during conversations, glancing at faces to gauge reactions, making natural eye contact that your entire socialization taught you was normal and appropriate. Each transgression would result in increasingly severe consequences. First lectures, then formal reprimands, finally dismissal and references, so negative that finding future employment would become nearly impossible. But let's imagine you somehow master the art of downward gazing servitude. You learn to navigate the world through peripheral vision and carefully averted eyes. You develop the ability to serve tea and dust furniture while maintaining the appearance of someone who's never seen a human face. Congratulations, you've successfully dehumanized yourself enough to avoid immediate termination. Your reward? 6 hours of polishing silver while maintaining that same level of invisible perfection. And after 3 hours of polishing the same fork 17 times while keeping your eyes appropriately downcast, you're going to start questioning whether human dignity was really worth the effort anyway. 6. You'd snap by day 3. Of polishing silver, you're sitting in what can only be described as a metallic purgatory, surrounded by approximately 400 pieces of silver that need to be polished to a finish so brilliant that passing angels might mistake them for heavenly artifacts. Not just shiny, we're talking mirror-perfect, reflection so clear you can see your own despair in it levels of polish. The Pemberton household possessed enough silverware to outfit a small kingdom, which makes perfect sense for a family of 6 people who apparently require 17 different types of spoons to achieve proper dining satisfaction. Dinner forks, salad forks, fish forks, dessert forks, fruit forks, and mysterious specialty forks whose purposes remained forever unclear, but which definitely required the same meticulous attention as everything else. Knives existed for bread, butter, fish, meat, cheese, and apparently activities that normal humans had never heard of, but which Victorian society deemed essential for civilized living. Because obviously, one cannot properly consume dairy products without specialized cutlery designed specifically for that noble purpose. Spoons came in 17 different varieties, each with specific purposes that some brilliant Victorian minds had decided were absolutely crucial for human survival. Teaspoons, soup spoons, dessert spoons, serving spoons, sauce spoons, sugar spoons, and what appeared to be ceremonial spoons designed purely to make your life more interesting in ways you'd never requested. Then came the serving pieces, elaborate tureens that looked like medieval torture devices, repurposed for gravy distribution, ornate platters with enough decorative scrollwork to hide 6 months of tarnish, and ceremonial pieces so complex they required engineering degrees to clean properly. Clearly, someone had decided that simple food service was insufficient for truly refined households. The polishing process was mind-numbing in its precision and soul-crushing in its repetition. Each piece demanded the same tedious routine: apply cleaner that smelled like industrial disappointment, mixed with chemical optimism, scrub away tarnish with the enthusiasm of someone diffusing a bomb, rinse, dry, apply polish, buff to shine, inspect for imaginary imperfections, repeat until your sanity evaporates into the ether. A single dinner fork required 4 minutes of concentrated effort. If you worked with maximum efficiency, multiply that by 400 pieces, and you're looking at roughly 27 hours of continuous polishing. But naturally, you don't have 27 continuous hours. You have maybe 6 hours scattered throughout the day, between your other 17 impossible duties. What a perfectly reasonable schedule designed by people who clearly understood the limitations of human endurance. The cleaning compound was basically acid disguised as household product, because apparently regular soap was insufficient for achieving the levels of metallic perfection demanded by civilized society. Your hands would be raw within hours, your cuticles destroyed, your nails permanently stained with chemical evidence of your dedication to silverware excellence. The burns made gripping the polishing cloth feel like handling molten metal, but there were still 399 pieces waiting for your attention, each one eagerly anticipating its turn to consume what remained of your physical comfort. Lady Pemberton approached silver inspection with the dedication of a forensic scientist investigating crimes against cutlery, and the critical eye of someone who'd apparently never encountered an acceptable level of shine in her entire life. She examined each piece individually, turning it in the light like she was appraising crown jewels, searching for water spots that existed primarily in theoretical dimensions and fingerprints that could be detected only with equipment not yet invented by science. Find a microscopic smudge on a teaspoon that's been polished for 30 minutes. Clearly evidence of laziness and declining moral character. Miss a tiny spot of tarnish hidden in decorative scrollwork that would challenge professional archaeologists to locate. Obviously slovenly behavior that reflected poorly on your upbringing and fundamental fitness for employment. Leave the faintest suggestion of a fingerprint that might be visible under perfect lighting conditions to someone with supernatural vision. Undeniable proof of poor character and the kind of declining standards that threatened the very foundations of civilized society. Each criticism came with educational lectures about proper technique, appropriate standards, and the moral importance of taking pride in work that barely paid enough to keep you alive. Because, apparently, not achieving supernatural perfection while polishing eating utensils for poverty wages indicated fundamental character flaws that could be corrected through sufficient instruction and regular humiliation. What a thoughtful system designed to help servants achieve their full potential through constructive feedback and character development opportunities. The worst part was the Sisyphean nature of the task that would make ancient Greek torture specialists weep with admiration. Silver tarnishes constantly, like it's personally offended by cleanliness and determined to mock your efforts. The moment you finished polishing the last piece, the first pieces were already starting to lose their shine with the enthusiasm of metals that had given up on life. It was like trying to fill a bathtub with the drain open while someone stood nearby criticizing your water pouring technique, a never-ending cycle of futile effort designed to drive anyone with remaining sanity to complete mental breakdown. Modern people cannot comprehend this level of repetitive precision applied to objects that serve no purpose beyond demonstrating wealth. We live in the glorious age of good enough and close enough, and nobody's going to notice that microscopic imperfection anyway. The idea of spending 6 hours polishing eating utensils to jeweler quality standards strikes us as a form of occupational therapy, specifically designed for people who'd committed serious crimes against humanity. But Victorian employers had unlimited time to notice imperfections that would escape detection by professional quality inspectors, and unlimited authority to demand corrections that would challenge the patience of saints. They had literally nothing else to do except find fault with the work of people desperately trying to meet impossible standards while earning barely enough to purchase the bread they were too tired to eat. What a productive use of everyone's time and energy. By day 2, your hands would be bleeding from chemical exposure and repetitive motion injuries that modern workplace safety regulations exist specifically to prevent. The polishing compound would have eaten through your skin like gentle acid mixed with good intentions, leaving painful cracks that made gripping anything feel like voluntary participation in medieval torture techniques. Your back would be screaming from hunching over the work table in positions that human spines weren't designed to maintain. Your shoulders would ache from repetitive motions that evolution had somehow failed to prepare your muscles for, probably because early humans had more sense than to spend their days making eating utensils shiny enough to blind passing wildlife. By day 3, you'd be having meaningful conversations with the silverware, not because you'd gone insane, though that was certainly a reasonable possibility, but because isolation and repetition had broken down normal social filters in ways that would fascinate modern psychologists. You'd find yourself explaining to a particularly stubborn soup ladle why it needed to achieve higher levels of reflective excellence, or apologizing to a dessert fork for scrubbing too enthusiastically in your desperation to meet impossible standards. The other servants wouldn't think this was strange behavior. They'd all reached the point where talking to inanimate objects seemed perfectly reasonable compared to the alternative communication options available in their current circumstances. It was either converse with the cutlery or talk to yourself, and talking to yourself was considered a sign of mental instability that could result in immediate dismissal and possible commitment to institutions designed to help people who'd lost their grip on reality. Much better to maintain the illusion of sanity by limiting your conversations to kitchen implements and dining accessories. The silver polishing shift was where servant souls went to die slow, shiny deaths. It was where the last remnants of personal dignity were gradually worn away by hours of mindless repetition and impossible standards that seemed designed by people who'd never held jobs requiring actual work. Experienced servants approached silver duty with the grim resignation of soldiers heading into battles they couldn't win, knowing they were about to spend the next several hours in a state of barely controlled desperation while handling objects worth more than their annual salaries. You develop what could only be described as silver-induced madness, a condition that Victorian medical professionals had somehow failed to recognize despite its obvious prevalence among domestic staff. Every reflection in every polished surface would become a personal attack on your competence. Every fingerprint would feel like deliberate sabotage attempt by invisible enemies. You'd start to believe that the silver was actively conspiring against you, tarnishing faster just to spite your efforts and mock your increasingly desperate attempts to achieve the impossible standards of people who had clearly never polished anything more challenging than their own egos. The breaking point would come somewhere around the third hour of day 3, when you'd spent 45 minutes polishing a single ornate serving spoon only to discover a microscopic water spot that meant starting the entire process over again. That's when the last thread of your sanity would snap with an almost audible twang. Not violently, not dramatically, just quietly, internally, permanently. You'd set down the polishing cloth, look at the remaining 150 pieces waiting for attention, and realize that you'd rather be literally anywhere else in the world, doing literally anything else, rather than spending one more minute making rich people's eating utensils shiny enough to serve as emergency signaling devices. Modern people would quit immediately and find employment that didn't require sacrificing their mental health for the sake of cutlery maintenance. Victorian servants couldn't afford that luxury. They'd just develop a 1,000-yard stare and continue polishing while their minds retreated to safer, happier places where silverware didn't exist and nothing ever needed to be shiny. But let's say you somehow survive the silver polishing nightmare without losing your grip on reality entirely. Let's imagine you develop the psychological resilience necessary to spend hours each day making eating utensils sparkle for people who consider your existence barely worth acknowledging. Congratulations, you're ready for the next challenge in your Victorian Servant adventure. And that challenge involves something that will make silver polishing look like a relaxing hobby. Trying to perform all this demanding work while subsisting on table scraps and leftover crusts that wouldn't satisfy a particularly small bird. You'll be polishing silver serving pieces used for elaborate 5-course meals while your own stomach gnaws at itself from malnutrition. The irony is about to become deeply, personally, painfully obvious. 7. You'd starve right next to a roast duck. You're standing in the kitchen at 7 in the evening, having worked for 15 straight hours, and the aroma of perfectly roasted duck is making your stomach perform Olympic-level gymnastics. The golden brown bird sits on the carving board like a monument to everything you can't have, its crispy skin glistening under the lamplight, practically begging to be devoured by someone who actually appreciates fine cuisine. That someone is not you. You've spent the last 3 hours preparing this magnificent feast, basting the duck, preparing the orange sauce, arranging the vegetables, creating a culinary masterpiece that would make professional chefs weep with envy. Your hands shaped every element of this meal. Your skill made it possible. Your labor created this edible work of art. And your dinner? A bowl of thin gruel that could charitably be described as porridge if you squinted and used your imagination. The contrast is so absurd, it borders on comedy. You're surrounded by enough food to feed a small village, roasted meats, fresh vegetables, elaborate desserts, fine wines, exotic delicacies imported from around the world, while you subsist on what can only be described as flavored water with occasional lumps. Victorian servant meals were designed with one primary goal, keeping you alive long enough to continue working. Nutrition, flavor, variety, and basic human dignity were considered unnecessary luxuries. You were fed like livestock, given just enough to maintain basic functionality while ensuring you never forgot your place in the social hierarchy. Your typical breakfast consisted of porridge made from the cheapest possible oats, mixed with water instead of milk, because milk was for people who mattered. No sugar, no fruit, no flavor of any kind. Just grey, lumpy paste that had roughly the same nutritional value and considerably less taste than the cardboard box it might have come in. Lunch, if you were lucky enough to get one, was bread, not fresh bread. That was for the family. Not even day-old bread that went to the upper servants. You got bread that was approximately one step away from being classified as a building material. hard, stale, and occasionally inhabited by wildlife that had moved in when the bread was fresher and more hospitable. Your evening meal was the highlight of your culinary day, which tells you everything you need to know about the quality of your other meals. It consisted of whatever scraps remained after everyone else had eaten, mixed together into a stew that was generous in quantity and tragic in quality. The stew was a democratic dish. It accepted contributions from any leftover that couldn't be saved for tomorrow. Vegetable peelings, meat trimmings, bread crusts, and mysterious substances that might once have been food all made their way into the servant's stew pot. It was like a culinary lottery where every ticket was a loser. Meanwhile, 15 feet away, the family was enjoying a 7-course dinner that would have impressed royalty. Fresh oysters, clear soups, delicate fish dishes, perfectly cooked meats, seasonal vegetables prepared with skill and artistry, elaborate desserts, and wines that cost more per bottle than you earned in a month. You could smell everything. You could see everything as you carried dishes back and forth from the dining room. You knew exactly how each dish was prepared because you'd helped prepare it. You understood the subtle flavors, the careful seasoning, the precise timing that went into creating each course. And you ate gruel. The psychological torture was exquisite in its cruelty. It wasn't enough to simply deny you good food. You had to be constantly reminded of what you were missing. Every meal you served was a demonstration of the life you could never have, the pleasures that were forever beyond your reach, the simple human joy of eating something that actually tasted good. The rules about servant food were elaborate and strictly enforced. You couldn't eat anything that was intended for the family, even if it was about to spoil. You couldn't take leftovers unless they were officially designated as servant food. You couldn't even taste the dishes you were preparing to ensure they were properly seasoned. That was considered theft. Theft, tasting food to make sure it was good enough to serve, was considered stealing. The portions were carefully controlled to ensure you got exactly enough calories to perform your duties and not 1 calorie more. Being adequately fed might make you comfortable, and comfortable servants might start thinking they deserved better treatment. Can't have that. You'd watch the family leave half-finished plates of exquisite food that would then be scraped into the garbage while you gnawed on bread crusts that could double as construction materials. Perfectly good roast beef, untouched vegetables, elaborate desserts, all thrown away while you fought hunger pangs that made concentration impossible. The irony was maddening. You were surrounded by abundance while experiencing genuine scarcity. You had intimate knowledge of fine cuisine while subsisting on what could generously be called food-adjacent substances. You possessed the skills to create culinary masterpieces while being denied the basic pleasure of eating something that didn't taste like punishment. Modern people would be outraged by this arrangement. We're accustomed to workplace benefits, employee discounts, and the basic human right to eat food that doesn't actively hate us. The idea of preparing gourmet meals while being fed like a prisoner would strike us as a human rights violation. But Victorian employers saw it differently. Feeding servants well was considered wasteful extravagance that might give them ideas above their station, keep them hungry, and they'd be grateful for any employment that provided even minimal sustenance, keep them weak, and they'd be less likely to cause trouble or seek better opportunities. The hunger was constant and debilitating. It affected your ability to think clearly, your physical strength, your emotional stability, and your capacity to perform the demanding work that was required. You'd be polishing silver while your stomach cramped from emptiness. You'd be serving elaborate meals while dizzy from malnutrition. You'd be maintaining perfect posture and professional demeanor while your body slowly consumed itself. The class system required that servants remain visibly inferior to their employers in every possible way. Well-fed servants might start to look healthy and prosperous, which would blur the essential distinction between the people who mattered and the people who didn't. Better to keep everyone in their proper place through strategic malnutrition. You'd develop an obsession with food that would make modern dieters look casual. Every meal became a desperate attempt to extract maximum nutrition from minimal ingredients. You'd savor each bite of stale bread like it was fine pastry. You'd treasure every scrap of meat like it was precious metal. The psychological effects were lasting and profound. Former servants who later achieved better circumstances often hoarded food compulsively, unable to believe that abundance might be permanent. The trauma of constant hunger left scars that lasted lifetimes. But surely the malnutrition was the worst part of servant life, right? Surely nothing could be more challenging than performing demanding physical labor while slowly starving. Oh, sweet, naive fool. The hunger was just the appetizer. The main course was the rules, hundreds of them, covering every conceivable aspect of human behavior, each one designed to make your life more complicated and your existence more precarious. You thought being hungry was difficult? Wait until you discover that there's a specific rule about which direction you're supposed to dust furniture, and getting it wrong is grounds for immediate dismissal. 8. You'd get whiplash from all the rules. There are 347 rules governing how you dust a mantelpiece. Not approximately 347, exactly 347, because some Victorian housekeeper with far too much time and an alarming attention to detail actually wrote them all down and expected you to memorize them. You must dust clockwise, never counterclockwise, because counterclockwise dusting apparently offends the natural order of the universe. You must never lift decorative objects completely off their surfaces, only raise them slightly to clean underneath, because fully removing them suggests you might be planning theft. You must use exactly 3 passes with the cloth for each surface, because 2 passes indicate laziness, while 4 passes suggest you're wasting time. The cloth must be folded in a specific pattern that maximizes cleaning surface while maintaining proper appearance. Your posture while dusting must communicate diligence without suggesting pride. Your breathing should be quiet enough not to disturb any dust that hasn't been officially designated for removal. These aren't suggestions. These are ironclad laws that govern your every movement, monitored by supervisors who apparently have nothing better to do than ensure that furniture cleaning adheres to standards that would make military drill sergeants weep with joy. Modern people cannot comprehend this level of micromanagement. We're used to being told, clean the house, and being left alone to figure out the details. Victorian servants operated under a system that regulated everything from the angle of their wrists, while polishing to the precise number of steps they should take between furniture pieces. The rule book, yes, there was an actual rule book, covered topics ranging from the sublime to the ridiculous. Rule 23. Servants must never be seen from the front windows. Rule 156. Door handles should be polished with vertical strokes only. Rule 289. Carpets must be swept toward the fireplace, never away from it, except during months, beginning with the letter A's when the direction reverses. These rules weren't created for practical reasons. They existed to establish control, to demonstrate power, and to ensure that servants never experienced a moment of autonomy or independent decision-making. Every action had to be performed according to predetermined specifications, leaving no room for personal judgment or individual preference. You'd spend your first week frantically trying to memorize hundreds of seemingly arbitrary regulations while performing physically demanding work under constant supervision. Your brain would be splitting its attention between basic tasks like don't drop things and complex protocols like remember that Tuesday tea service requires different cup placement than Wednesday tea service. The stairs alone had 47 specific rules, which stairs you could use, and when, how quickly you could ascend or descend, whether you were allowed to use the handrail, usually not, which foot should lead when going up versus going down, the proper way to carry various objects while navigating stairs, the acceptable level of noise your footsteps could produce. Rule violations weren't just corrected, they were catalogued, recorded, and used as evidence of your fundamental unsuitability for employment. 3 minor infractions could result in formal warnings. 5 minor infractions became 1 major infraction. 2 major infractions meant dismissal and negative references that would make finding future employment nearly impossible. The genius of the system was that it made compliance virtually impossible while making violation inevitable. No human being could remember and perfectly execute hundreds of specific behavioral requirements while performing complex physical tasks under time pressure. Everyone violated rules constantly, which meant everyone lived in constant fear of punishment. You'd develop a form of performance anxiety that would make stage fright look like mild concern. Every action became a potential mistake. Every movement could be grounds for criticism. Every breath you took was subject to evaluation and potential correction. The bathroom rules were particularly elaborate. How long you were allowed to spend, what time of day you could use facilities, the proper way to clean yourself afterward, the specific protocol for requesting permission to attend to personal needs, the appropriate level of urgency required before such requests would be considered legitimate. Yes, you needed permission to use the bathroom, and that permission could be denied if your timing was inconvenient or if supervisors suspected you were using biological necessities as an excuse to avoid work. Table setting rules required a separate manual, 17 different types of formal place settings, each with specific requirements for plate placement, silverware arrangement, napkin positioning, and glassware organization. Get the soup spoon 3 millimeters out of position, and you'd be subjected to a lecture about attention to detail and proper standards. The walking rules were particularly insane. Different rooms required different gaits. The drawing room demanded graceful gliding. The kitchen required efficient but quiet movement. The library called for near-silent shuffling. The dining room needed confident but deferential striding. You were expected to instantly adjust your physical presence to match the requirements of each space. Clothing rules governed everything from how you tied your apron, bow positioned exactly 3 inches from the right hip, to the acceptable level of starch in your collar, rigid enough to maintain shape, soft enough not to crackle audibly. Your hair had to be arranged in specific styles that varied by your position, the day of the week, and whether the family was entertaining guests. The conversation rules were the most psychologically damaging. When you could speak rarely, what tone was appropriate, humble but not servile, which topics were acceptable, virtually none. How to address different members of the household hierarchy, with titles that changed based on context, the proper way to receive criticism gratefully, regardless of its accuracy or fairness. You weren't allowed to express opinions, ask questions, or show any sign of having thoughts that weren't directly related to your immediate duties. Your personality had to be completely suppressed in favor of a carefully constructed persona that communicated competence, humility, and complete lack of individual identity. Modern workplace harassment laws exist specifically to prevent the kind of psychological abuse that Victorian servants experienced as normal employment conditions. The constant monitoring, the arbitrary rules, the systematic denial of basic dignity, all of it would be considered illegal today. But Victorian employers weren't trying to create hostile work environments. They were trying to maintain social order through systematic dehumanization. The rules weren't designed to be fair or reasonable. They were designed to reinforce the fundamental difference between people who mattered and people who didn't. The enforcement was random and unpredictable, which made the anxiety constant. You might violate Rule 127 concerning the proper way to dust picture frames 17 times without consequence, then be severely reprimanded the 18th time because a supervisor happened to be watching. The uncertainty was deliberate. It kept servants in a permanent state of hypervigilance. You'd never relax. You'd never feel confident. You'd never experience the simple pleasure of performing a task well without worrying about whether you'd unknowingly violated some obscure regulation that would result in punishment and humiliation. The cumulative effect was complete psychological breakdown. Servants developed nervous conditions, anxiety disorders, and various stress-related illnesses that were dismissed as character weaknesses rather than predictable responses to systematic abuse. But just when you thought the rules were the worst part of servant life, just when you'd accepted that your every movement would be regulated and your every action would be criticized, you'd discover that all of this was just preparation for the real nightmare. Because tomorrow is laundry day, and Victorian laundry wasn't just washing clothes. It was a 48-hour endurance test that would make you question whether clean clothing was really worth the torture required to achieve it. 9. You'd collapse during laundry day. Monday morning arrives with all the subtle charm of a natural disaster, and you realize that everything you've endured so far, the impossible rules, the starvation diet, the psychological warfare, was actually just warm-up exercises for the main event, Victorian laundry day. Modern people have no concept of what laundry actually entailed before washing machines were invented by someone who clearly understood that life was too short to spend half of it manually cleaning clothes. You think doing laundry means throwing things in a machine, adding detergent, and pressing a button. How quaint. How absolutely, adorably naive. Victorian laundry was a multi-day athletic event that would challenge Olympic athletes and probably kill most modern humans outright. It required the stamina of a marathon runner, the upper body strength of a professional wrestler, and the heat tolerance of someone who voluntarily lived inside a volcano. The process begins at 4 in the morning, because of course it does, with lighting the copper boiler, a massive metal cauldron that looks like it was designed for brewing potions or possibly torturing confessions out of suspected witches. This thing holds approximately 40 gallons of water that needs to be heated to temperatures that would make hell feel pleasantly cool. You spend the first hour just getting the fire hot enough to heat that much water, feeding coal into the furnace like you're stoking a steam engine. The heat in the laundry room becomes overwhelming. We're talking about tropical rainforest levels of humidity combined with desert-level temperatures. By 5 a.m., you're already soaked in sweat and questioning your life choices. But the real fun hasn't even started yet. The Pemberton household generates enough dirty laundry to supply a small town. There are bed linens, table linens, personal clothing for 6 family members, undergarments that Victorian modesty prevents us from discussing in detail, and approximately 47 different types of specialized textiles that require individualized treatment. Everything has to be sorted by fabric type, color, level of soiling, and washing requirements. Delicate items get one treatment, heavily soiled items get another, and white items get a process so complex it requires advanced planning and possibly a degree in chemistry. The whitewashing alone is a nightmare that would make modern people weep. Victorian standards for white would put contemporary laundry detergent commercials to shame. We're talking about white so pure it practically glowed, white so brilliant it could be seen from space, white that made fresh snow look dingy by comparison. Achieving this level of whiteness required a process that can only be described as textile torture. First, you soak everything overnight in cold water. Then you boil it in the copper with soap and washing soda. Then you transfer it to another tub for the first rinse. Then to another tub for the second rinse. Then to yet another tub for the bluing process, which involved adding precise amounts of blue dye to counteract yellow tints. Each transfer meant lifting waterlogged linens that weighed approximately as much as a small horse. Wet sheets became unwieldy monsters that fought back, trying to escape your grip and generally behaving like they had personal vendettas against your sanity. Your arms would be screaming by the third transfer, but you had approximately 20 more transfers to go. The scrubbing was where Victorian laundry crossed the line from difficult into genuinely insane. Stains weren't just washed out, they were declared war upon and eliminated through sustained physical violence. You'd use a washboard, which was basically a wooden torture device designed to destroy both fabric and human knuckles with equal efficiency. Scrub too gently, and the stains wouldn't come out. Scrub too vigorously, and you'd destroy the fabric. The technique required finding the exact pressure that would remove dirt without removing threads, which was like trying to perform surgery with a sledgehammer. Your knuckles would be raw and bleeding within the first hour. The washing soda would eat through your skin, leaving chemical burns that made gripping the washboard agony. But there were 30 more shirts to scrub, 40 pairs of stockings, 60 handkerchiefs, and various unmentionable undergarments that somehow managed to be both delicate and thoroughly disgusting. Modern people think laundry is difficult if they have to separate colors from whites. Victorian laundry maids had to master 17 different washing techniques, 12 different types of soap, 8 different rinsing processes, and a starch preparation method that would challenge professional chemists. Starching was its own special form of hell. Victorian clothing required starch levels that would make modern dress shirts look positively casual. Collars had to be stiff enough to maintain perfect shape, while remaining flexible enough not to decapitate the wearer. The starch mixture had to be exactly the right consistency, applied at precisely the right temperature, and worked into the fabric with a technique that took months to master. Get the starch wrong, and you'd have to start the entire process over again. Too thick, and the fabric would crack. Too thin, and the clothing would lose its shape. Too hot, and you'd create lumps. Too cold, and it wouldn't penetrate properly. It was like trying to bake a soufflé while running a marathon in a sauna. The ironing phase would break whatever was left of your will to live. Victorian irons were solid metal blocks heated on the stove, weighing approximately 15 pounds each. You'd have multiple irons heating simultaneously, switching them out as they cooled, maintaining constant pressure while maneuvering around buttons, pleats, ruffles, and decorative elements that seemed specifically designed to make ironing impossible. Each shirt required 45 minutes of careful pressing. Each dress took over an hour. Delicate items needed temperatures so precisely controlled that you'd be constantly testing the iron's heat on scraps of fabric, burning your fingers repeatedly in the process. The steam was continuous and overwhelming. You'd be working in a cloud of vapor that made breathing difficult and visibility nearly impossible. Your hair would be plastered to your head, your clothes soaked through with perspiration, your hands blistered from gripping hot metal implements for hours at a time. But wait, there's more. Because Victorian laundry wasn't complete until everything was properly dried. And drying laundry in London's perpetually damp climate was like trying to toast bread underwater. You'd hang items on lines strung throughout the house, creating an obstacle course of wet clothing that dripped constantly and took approximately forever to dry. Indoor drying meant the entire house smelled like wet wool and damp cotton. Humidity levels rose to tropical rainforest proportions. Clothing would hang for days, growing mold and mildew, while you waited desperately for some sign that the British weather might cooperate with your laundry schedule. The folding and storing process required its own specialized knowledge. Each type of garment had specific folding techniques designed to prevent wrinkles and maintain shape. Sheets needed to be folded in precise patterns that would allow easy identification and access. Clothing had to be arranged according to complex hierarchies that reflected both practical needs and social status. You'd spend hours creating perfect creases, measuring fold lines and arranging items with the precision of a museum curator. One wrinkle in a stored shirt meant the entire ironing process would need to be repeated. One improperly folded sheet meant criticism and possible punishment. The entire laundry process, from start to finish, took approximately 48 hours of continuous labor spread across 3 days. Monday was washing day, Tuesday was drying and starching day, Wednesday was ironing and storing day. By Thursday, you'd be so exhausted that basic motor functions became challenging. Modern people would collapse from heat exhaustion within the first 4 hours. We're accustomed to climate-controlled environments. ergonomic tools and machinery that does the heavy lifting. The idea of spending 2 full days manually washing, drying, and pressing clothing would strike us as a form of torture, specifically designed to punish people who'd committed serious crimes against humanity. Your hands would be destroyed, burned, blistered, and chemically damaged from constant exposure to harsh soaps and scalding water. Your back would be permanently curved from bending over washboards and ironing tables. Your shoulders would ache from lifting heavy, wet textiles. Your feet would be swollen from standing on hard floors for hours at a time. The psychological effects were equally devastating. The repetitive nature of the work, combined with the physical exhaustion and constant pressure to achieve impossible standards, created a form of mental breakdown that Victorian society simply ignored. Laundry maids were expected to maintain cheerful dispositions while performing labor that would challenge prison inmates. And just when you thought you'd survived the worst of it, just when you'd managed to complete one full laundry cycle without completely destroying your physical or mental health, you'd realize a horrible truth. Next week, you'd have to do it all over again. Because Victorian families generated dirty laundry at a rate that seemed to defy the laws of physics. How could 6 people possibly soil so many clothes in 1 week? The answer was that Victorian fashion required multiple outfit changes per day, elaborate undergarments that needed constant washing, and a level of cleanliness that bordered on the obsessive. The laundry was never finished. It was a perpetual cycle of washing, drying, ironing, and storing that continued relentlessly until either the clothes wore out or you died from exhaustion, whichever came first. But surely handling all this laundry was the most complicated part of servant life, right? Surely nothing could be more challenging than memorizing the washing requirements for 47 different types of fabric, while manually operating equipment that belonged in a medieval torture chamber. Actually, no. The laundry was physically demanding, but at least it was predictable. The real nightmare was about to begin, learning to navigate the complex social hierarchy of the household itself. Because Victorian homes weren't just filled with family members, they were filled with guests, visitors, and extended family members, each with their own titles, preferences, and specific requirements that you were expected to memorize and accommodate perfectly. And if you thought remembering laundry procedures was difficult, wait until you try to keep track of who gets called lady, who gets called miss, and who gets deeply offended if you use the wrong title. 10. You'd never remember who's upstairs. The Pemberton household operates like a constantly shifting diplomatic mission, where everyone has different ranks, titles, and protocols, and getting any of it wrong could spark an international incident. Except, instead of international incidents, you get fired and blacklisted from decent employment for the rest of your natural life. There are 12 permanent family members, but the definition of permanent is apparently quite flexible because the household population fluctuates like a Victorian version of musical chairs. Cousins appear and disappear without warning. Distant relatives materialize for extended visits. Friends of the family establish semi-permanent residence in guest bedrooms. Your job is to instantly recognize everyone, remember their exact social standing, understand their individual preferences, accommodate their personal quirks, and address them with precisely the correct level of deference, all while maintaining the illusion that you're practically invisible and certainly not important enough to have thoughts or opinions about any of this. Lady Pemberton is the undisputed queen of this domestic kingdom, and her preferences change with the phases of the moon. She takes her morning tea at exactly 8:15, except on Tuesdays when she prefers 8:30, unless it's raining, in which case she wants it at 8 o'clock sharp. The tea must be Darjeeling, but not too strong, served with exactly 1 lump of sugar and a precise splash of cream that she judges by some mystical standard that you'll never understand. Her daughter, Miss Catherine, considers herself a delicate flower who requires constant attention and specialized care. She's allergic to dust, sensitive to noise, prone to mysterious fainting spells, and generally operates under the assumption that the entire household exists solely to cater to her imaginary medical conditions. She requires her breakfasts served on specific china, her rooms heated to exactly 72 degrees, and her clothes arranged according to color schemes that change daily based on her mood. Master Edward, the eldest son, has the charming habit of treating servants like particularly dim-witted furniture that occasionally requires shouting at. He's loud, demanding, and has never learned that other people might have feelings or dignity worth considering. His room is constantly messy because he apparently believes that picking up after himself would compromise his masculinity. Then there's Lady Pemberton's sister, who visits monthly and treats the entire staff like personal enemies who've somehow infiltrated her family's home. She finds fault with everything: the temperature of her bath water, the stiffness of her bed linens, the volume of your breathing while you're trying to clean her room. She has the supernatural ability to detect microscopic imperfections and the unfortunate tendency to complain about them loudly and at great length. The visiting cousin from Yorkshire arrives without warning and expects everyone to instantly understand his specific dietary requirements, which apparently include avoiding anything that might contain flavor or nutritional value. He's suspicious of London food, London water, London air, and London servants, and he makes sure everyone knows about his suspicions through constant criticism and condescending lectures about how things are done properly in Yorkshire. The family friend who's staying for the season has brought her own lady's maid, which creates a complex hierarchy situation where you're not sure who outranks whom or how you're supposed to address. Someone who's technically a servant but works for someone who outranks your employer. The social mathematics involved in figuring out appropriate deference levels would challenge university professors. Then there are the business associates who come for dinner and expect to be treated like visiting royalty despite having the manners of particularly aggressive livestock. They make unreasonable demands, show no appreciation for service, and generally behave like they're doing everyone a tremendous favor by being insufferably rude. The elderly uncle, who's allegedly staying temporarily but has been there for 6 months, has very specific requirements about everything: his morning routine, his afternoon constitutional, his evening medications, and his middle-of-the-night needs that require you to be constantly available despite technically being off duty. He's also going deaf, which means every interaction involves shouting, but he gets offended if you raise your voice too much, because that's apparently disrespectful. Each person has their own breakfast preferences, bathing schedule, clothing requirements, and personal quirks that you're expected to memorize and accommodate. Lady Catherine likes her chocolate sweet, but not too sweet. Master Edward wants his boots polished, but not too shiny. The visiting cousin requires his morning newspaper ironed before reading, because wrinkled paper apparently offends his delicate sensibilities. The meal service alone requires a degree in social psychology. Different people eat at different times, have different dietary restrictions, prefer different seating arrangements, and require different levels of service. You need to remember who likes their tea strong, who can't tolerate dairy, who requires their meat cooked to specific temperatures, and who has mysterious allergies that seem to change depending on their mood. The title situation is a minefield that would challenge professional diplomats. Everyone has specific forms of address that must be used consistently and correctly. Lady Pemberton is Melody but never my lady. Apparently there's a crucial difference that everyone except you understands instinctively. Miss Catherine is Miss Catherine, to distinguish her from Miss Elizabeth, who's called Miss Elizabeth, even though she's technically the second daughter and should theoretically be Miss Elizabeth Pemberton in formal situations. The visiting relatives have their own complex title requirements that change depending on context, time of day, and presumably the current phase of Venus. The family friend gets Mrs., but with a specific pronunciation that suggests respect without implying equality. The business associates want to be treated with professional deference, but not social deference, which is apparently a meaningful distinction that you're supposed to understand through telepathy. Get any of this wrong? and you'll be subjected to lectures about proper respect, appropriate behavior, and the importance of understanding your place. Use miss when you should have used lady, and you've committed a social crime that reflects poorly on your character, your upbringing, and your fundamental fitness for civilized society. The gift-giving protocols are equally bewildering. Different people have different birthday traditions, holiday preferences, and anniversary expectations. You need to remember who likes flowers, who prefers chocolates, who has strong opinions about ribbon colors, and who considers gift wrapping to be an art form that reflects the giver's level of respect for the recipient. Modern people would develop spreadsheets to track all this information. We'd create databases, set calendar reminders, and possibly hire personal assistants to manage the complexity. Victorian servants were expected to remember everything through pure mental effort, while simultaneously performing physically demanding labor and operating on minimal nutrition and insufficient sleep. The social dynamics shift constantly as people arrive, depart, and rearrange themselves according to mysterious rules that everyone except you seems to understand instinctively. Alliances form and dissolve, preferences change, new requirements emerge, old rules become obsolete without notice. You'd spend your entire employment in a state of constant anxiety, never sure whether you were addressing people correctly, serving them appropriately, or meeting their ever-changing standards. Every interaction would be a potential disaster waiting to happen. Every conversation a diplomatic negotiation, where one wrong word could end your career. But just when you thought you'd mastered the art of invisible servitude while managing complex social hierarchies, just when you'd learned to navigate the treacherous waters of Victorian domestic politics, you'd discover that all of this was actually just the setup for an even more challenging psychological experiment. Because Victorian servant life wasn't just about working hard or following rules or remembering names, it was about maintaining a performance of grateful contentment while your dignity was systematically destroyed, your personality was suppressed, and your basic humanity was treated as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a reality to be respected. And that performance? That constant pretending that everything was wonderful while everything was actually terrible. That's where most people would finally break completely. 11. You'd mentally break from all the pretending. You've been smiling for 6 straight hours, and your face feels like it's going to crack. Not just any smile, the specific Victorian servant smile that communicates gratitude, competence, and complete absence of any independent thoughts or feelings. It's a smile that says, "I'm delighted to be here, thrilled to serve you, and definitely not planning to scream into a pillow later." The smile is mandatory. Not officially, there's no written rule that says servants must smile constantly, but the expectation is clear. You're supposed to be visibly happy about your circumstances, obviously grateful for your employment, and perpetually cheerful despite working 18-hour days for wages that barely cover basic survival, while being treated like a somewhat inconvenient piece of furniture. Modern people would find this level of emotional performance exhausting within minutes. We're used to expressing genuine emotions, showing frustration when frustrated, and generally being authentic human beings, rather than walking advertisements for the benefits of domestic servitude. But Victorian servants lived in a constant state of emotional theatre, performing happiness while experiencing misery, demonstrating gratitude while feeling resentment, and maintaining perfect composure while their souls slowly died from systematic dehumanization. Lady Pemberton has just spent 20 minutes lecturing you about the proper way to arrange flowers. Apparently yesterday's arrangement was completely inappropriate and showed a concerning lack of aesthetic sense. The criticism is delivered with the kind of passionate intensity usually reserved for discussing war crimes, and you're expected to respond with grateful appreciation for this valuable guidance. Your natural impulse would be to point out that the flowers looked perfectly fine, and that perhaps Lady Pemberton has too much time on her hands if she can spend 20 minutes analyzing the placement of daisies. Instead, you nod enthusiastically, thank her for the correction, and promise to do better next time, while maintaining that fixed smile that's becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. This happens approximately 15 times per day. Criticism, correction, instruction, and outright insults, delivered with the expectation that you'll receive them as gifts, rather than attacks on your competence and dignity. Each incident requires the same performance: grateful acceptance, humble acknowledgement, and visible determination to improve. The psychological toll is devastating. Modern people would develop stress disorders, anxiety conditions, and probably rage-induced medical problems from constantly suppressing normal human reactions to unreasonable treatment. Victorian servants were expected to suppress those reactions so completely that they eventually forgot they were entitled to have them. You're not allowed to show frustration when criticized unjustly. You can't express confusion when given contradictory instructions. You certainly can't display anger when treated with deliberate disrespect. Every negative emotion has to be internalized, suppressed, and transformed into an appropriate display of submissive gratitude. The breakfast incident perfectly illustrates the madness. You've prepared Master Edward's eggs exactly as he requested yesterday, soft-boiled for 3 minutes, served with toast cut diagonally, accompanied by marmalade on the side. Today he decides this is completely wrong. The eggs are too soft, the toast is cut incorrectly, and marmalade should be served in a separate dish rather than alongside the meal. He expresses these preferences through a 10-minute tirade about servant incompetence, the declining standards of domestic service, and your apparent inability to follow simple instructions. The fact that you followed his previous instructions perfectly is irrelevant. Apparently you should have telepathically understood that his preferences had changed overnight. Your response must be a masterpiece of self-abnegation. You apologize profusely for your mistake, thank him for the clarification, and promise to remember his preferences in the future. You cannot point out the contradiction. You cannot suggest that perhaps he could have mentioned these changes earlier. You certainly cannot express any irritation at being criticized for following his explicit instructions. The smile never wavers. Your tone remains respectful and grateful. Your posture communicates appropriate humility. Meanwhile, inside your head, you're screaming. This performance happens in every interaction with every family member throughout every day. You're constantly apologizing for things that aren't your fault, thanking people for treating you badly, and expressing gratitude for opportunities to be humiliated. The psychological dissonance is unbearable. Your authentic emotions, frustration, anger, resentment, basic human dignity, are constantly at war with your performed emotions: gratitude, contentment, eager civility. The conflict between what you feel and what you're required to express would drive most modern people to complete mental breakdown within days. Victorian servants developed coping mechanisms that ranged from unhealthy to genuinely concerning. Some became genuinely convinced that their treatment was appropriate and their employers were generous benefactors. Others developed elaborate internal fantasy lives where they imagined revenge scenarios that would never be acted upon. Many simply dissociated, going through the motions of grateful servitude while their minds retreated to safer, less painful places. The constant performance requirement extended beyond working hours. Even during your brief rest periods, you were expected to maintain appropriate attitudes and emotions. Complaining about your circumstances, even to other servants, was considered ungrateful and could result in dismissal. You had to pretend to be happy, even when you weren't working, even when no one was watching, even in your own thoughts. The psychological control was totalitarian in its scope. Victorian employers didn't just want your labor, they wanted your emotional compliance, your psychological submission, and your complete acceptance of their authority over every aspect of your existence. You'd find yourself losing track of your authentic emotions. After months of performing gratitude, the line between performance and reality would begin to blur. After years of smiling while being mistreated, your face would forget how to express genuine displeasure. After decades of suppressing normal human reactions, you'd forget that those reactions were normal and justified. The isolation was crushing. You couldn't share your real thoughts with your employers because that would be insubordination. You couldn't share them with other servants because that would be disloyalty. You couldn't share them with family or friends because that would be complaining about your betters. Your authentic self became a secret that had to be hidden from everyone, including yourself. Modern people would recognize this as psychological abuse of the most sophisticated kind. The constant requirement to perform contentment while experiencing misery, to express gratitude for mistreatment, and to suppress normal human emotions is a form of torture that would be considered a war crime if practiced on prisoners. But Victorian society saw it as character building. The ability to maintain cheerful demeanor while being systematically degraded was considered a virtue. Servants who could smile while being screamed at were praised for their excellent temperament and professional attitude. The breaking point would come suddenly and without warning. One day, probably after being criticized for something completely beyond your control, while maintaining that fixed smile of grateful acceptance, something inside you would simply snap. Not violently. Victorian servants couldn't afford violent breakdowns, but quietly, permanently, irreversibly. You'd continue performing the role of grateful servant, but you'd be performing it from outside yourself, watching your own life like a theater production in which you were both actor and audience. The last remnants of your authentic personality would retreat so far inside that they might never resurface. And the truly horrifying part, this psychological destruction was considered success. A servant who no longer showed any signs of independent thought or authentic emotion was considered perfectly trained, ideally suited for long-term employment, and a credit to the household. But even this complete psychological submission wasn't the end of the horror show, because Victorian servants didn't just work. They lived in the same houses where they worked, which meant your brief rest periods weren't actually rest at all. They were just different forms of performance, different ways of pretending to be something you weren't. And when you finally got a few minutes to yourself, when you thought you might finally drop the mask and just be human for a moment, that's when you'd discover that even your so-called free time was just another opportunity for surveillance, criticism, and control. 12. You'd burn out from double lives. Your 15-minute break has arrived, the single quarter hour of the day when you're theoretically free to be human instead of a walking domestic appliance. You stumble down to the servants' hall, looking forward to exactly 900 seconds of not being criticized, corrected, or required to smile while being insulted. What you find instead is a carefully orchestrated surveillance operation disguised as leisure time. The servants' hall operates under the same rigid hierarchy that governs the rest of the house, except now you're supposed to pretend you're enjoying yourself while being monitored by your colleagues, who are also pretending to enjoy themselves while watching you for signs of insubordination or inappropriate attitudes. The cook sits at the head of the table because she outranks everyone except the butler, who isn't present because he takes his breaks separately to maintain proper social distinctions. The ladies' maids occupy the middle seats because they're closer to the family than general servants, but not as important as specialized staff. You, as the newest and lowest-ranking servant, get whatever seat remains available, which is usually positioned for maximum discomfort and optimal surveillance. Everyone is performing carefully calculated versions of relaxation. The conversation is light, cheerful, and completely devoid of any genuine human emotion or authentic observation about your shared circumstances. You're all pretending to be a happy family of devoted servants who just happen to love their jobs so much that they spend their break time discussing how wonderful their employers are. The cook shares amusing anecdotes about Lady Pemberton's charming quirks, delivered with the kind of forced affection usually reserved for discussing beloved relatives, rather than people who regularly scream at you for minor infractions. The senior housemaid contributes delightful stories about the family's endearing habits, carefully avoiding any mention of the fact that these habits make your life significantly more difficult than necessary. You're expected to contribute to this performance by sharing your own tales of grateful servitude, expressing appreciation for the valuable learning experiences provided by constant criticism, and demonstrating appropriate enthusiasm for the privilege of working 18-hour days for subsistence wages. Modern people would recognize this immediately as toxic workplace culture taken to its logical extreme. The idea that your break time should be spent performing gratitude for your employment would strike us as genuinely insane. We understand that work is work and personal time is personal time, and mixing the two is a recipe for psychological disaster. But Victorian servants lived in a world where there was no separation between work and personal life, because there was no personal life. Your entire existence was work, and your brief rest periods were just different types of work that required different types of performance. The surveillance is constant but subtle. Every comment you make is noted and potentially reported. Every expression that crosses your face is observed and interpreted. Every gesture is analyzed for signs of discontent, disloyalty, or inappropriate attitude. Laugh too loudly, and you might be reported for being disruptive. Remain too quiet, and you could be accused of sulking or showing poor spirit. Express any opinion that isn't completely positive, and you'll be branded as a complainer with a bad attitude. The social dynamics are so carefully calibrated that even experienced servants sometimes make mistakes that result in disciplinary action. The topics of conversation are rigidly controlled through unspoken but universally understood rules. You can discuss the weather, but only in positive terms. Complaining about rain or cold suggests ingratitude for your circumstances. You can mention family members, but only in ways that demonstrate your complete dedication to your employment above all personal relationships. You cannot discuss your wages, working conditions, or treatment by employers. You cannot express any dissatisfaction with your circumstances or suggest that anything about your employment could be improved. You cannot show solidarity with other servants who might be struggling, because that would suggest disloyalty to the household. The psychological pressure is enormous. You're surrounded by people who are experiencing the same misery, the same exhaustion, the same systematic dehumanization, but everyone has to pretend that everything is wonderful. It's like being trapped in a psychological experiment designed to test how long human beings can maintain obviously false facades before their minds collapse entirely. The senior servants are the worst, because they've been performing this charade so long that they might actually believe it. They've internalized the ideology of grateful servitude so completely that they genuinely seem to think their treatment is appropriate and their employers are generous benefactors rather than people who are systematically exploiting their labor. These long-term servants become enforcers of the system, monitoring newer servants for signs of inappropriate attitudes and reporting any behavior that suggests insufficient gratitude or dedication. They've survived by becoming collaborators in their own oppression, and they expect everyone else to do the same. You'd find yourself walking a psychological tightrope during every break, trying to appear appropriately grateful and content, while not saying anything that could be interpreted as criticism or complaint. The mental effort required to maintain this performance during your supposedly relaxing break time would be more exhausting than the actual work. The loneliness is crushing. You're surrounded by people experiencing identical circumstances, but you can't acknowledge that shared experience or find comfort in mutual understanding. Everyone is isolated in their own performance of contentment, unable to reach out for genuine human connection, because genuine human connection would require admitting that something is wrong. Modern people would develop severe anxiety disorders from this level of constant surveillance and performance pressure. We need spaces where we can be authentic, express genuine emotions, and connect with others who understand our experiences. The idea of being monitored and judged, even during our rest periods, would be recognizable as a form of psychological torture. The breaks become more stressful than the work because at least during work you know what's expected of you. During breaks, you're trying to navigate complex social dynamics while maintaining a performance that feels increasingly unnatural and unsustainable. You'd start to lose track of your authentic thoughts and feelings. After months of performing contentment during every social interaction, you'd begin to question whether your dissatisfaction was legitimate or whether you were just being ungrateful and difficult. The constant gaslighting would make you doubt your own perceptions and experiences. The other servants would become both your only human contact and your greatest source of stress. They're the people who understand your circumstances best, but they're also the people most likely to report you for inappropriate attitudes. You develop paranoid tendencies, constantly wondering whether your colleagues were genuinely friendly or just gathering information to share with supervisors. The system created a perfect psychological trap. You needed human connection to maintain sanity, but seeking that connection was dangerous because it required revealing authentic thoughts and feelings that could be used against you. You'd become increasingly isolated, suspicious, and emotionally numb as protective mechanisms against the constant threat of surveillance and punishment. Even your private thoughts would become suspect. You'd start to self-censor internally, afraid that somehow your real opinions might leak out through your expressions or behavior. The line between performance and reality would blur until you weren't sure which thoughts were authentic and which were just extensions of your required persona. But just when you thought you'd mastered the art of performing contentment during your supervised break time, just when you'd learned to maintain appropriate attitudes while being constantly monitored by colleagues who were performing their own versions of the same charade, you'd discover that the surveillance extended even further than you'd imagined. Because Victorian households weren't just workplaces, they were total institutions where every aspect of your existence was subject to control and judgment, and that control included your interactions with the outside world, your personal relationships, and even your romantic life, which, as you're about to discover, created situations so psychologically damaging that they would make everything you've experienced so far look like a pleasant warm-up exercise. 13. You'd panic the first time a guest hits on you. You're dusting the library when Mr. Hartwell, Lady Pemberton's cousin visiting from Surrey, decides that the bookshelf cleaning process would be significantly improved by his personal supervision and commentary. This wouldn't be problematic, except that his supervision involves standing uncomfortably close. His commentary focuses primarily on your physical attributes rather than your dusting technique. And his idea of helpful guidance includes suggestions that have absolutely nothing to do with library maintenance. The situation escalates quickly from awkward to terrifying as you realize that Mr. Hartwell considers your employment status to be less about domestic service and more about personal availability for his entertainment. His comments become increasingly inappropriate. His proximity becomes increasingly invasive, and your options for dealing with the situation become increasingly non-existent. Because here's the thing about being a Victorian servant. You have no power, no protection, and no recourse when members of the household decide to treat you like property rather than people. The social system that places you so far below your employers also removes any possibility of refusing their advances, reporting their behavior, or seeking help when situations become dangerous. Victorian society had very clear rules about sexual propriety, but those rules applied exclusively to interactions between social equals. When upper-class men pursued working-class women, especially servants in their own households, the moral calculations became significantly more flexible. The same society that would ostracize a gentleman for inappropriate behavior toward a lady would turn a blind eye to identical behavior toward a maid. Mr. Hartwell's approach is sophisticated in its simplicity. He's created a situation where refusing his advances would be grounds for dismissal while accepting them would also be grounds for dismissal. It's a perfectly designed trap that demonstrates the complete powerlessness of your position. If you refuse his suggestions, you're being disobedient to a family member, which is grounds for immediate termination. If you report his behavior, you'll be accused of lying about your betters, which is grounds for immediate termination, and possible criminal charges for slander. If you accept his advances, you'll be dismissed for moral turpitude and loose character. The brilliance of the system is that it places all the responsibility on you while giving you no actual choices. Whatever happens will be your fault, regardless of who initiated it or what your actual preferences might be. You're simultaneously responsible for preventing unwanted advances and powerless to actually prevent them. Modern people would recognize this immediately as sexual harassment in a workplace environment where the victim has no legal protections and no realistic options for seeking help. We have laws, reporting mechanisms, and social support systems designed to address exactly these situations. Victorian servants had none of those protections. Mr. Hartwell's technique involves casual touches that could be dismissed as accidental. If challenged, compliments that sound respectful but carry obvious implications, and suggestions for private meetings that are presented as legitimate household business, but clearly serve other purposes. He's created plausible deniability for every action, while making his intentions increasingly clear. Your response options are limited and uniformly terrible. Ignore his advances, and he'll escalate until ignoring becomes impossible. Confront him directly, and you'll be accused of insubordination and inappropriate behavior toward a family member. Submit to his demands, and you'll be blamed for encouraging immoral behavior. The psychological pressure is devastating. You're trying to perform your regular duties while navigating an increasingly dangerous social situation that could destroy your employment and reputation, regardless of how you handle it. Every interaction becomes a potential trap. Every response a possible mistake that could have catastrophic consequences. The other servants are no help because acknowledging what's happening would require admitting that the household isn't the perfectly moral environment everyone pretends it to be. They'll offer vague warnings about being careful around certain gentlemen, but they can't provide actual support or protection because they're just as powerless as you are. The family members who might have authority to intervene have strong incentives not to notice what's happening. Addressing Mr. Hartwell's behavior would create family conflict, social embarrassment, and uncomfortable questions about household management. It's much easier to blame the servant for creating problems than to hold family members accountable for their actions. Victorian society had developed elaborate moral codes that supposedly protected women's virtue and honor, but those protections evaporated when the women in question were servants. The same behavior that would provoke duels and social scandals when directed toward upper-class women was considered a minor indiscretion when the targets were working-class employees. The double standard was so institutionalized that many upper-class men genuinely believed that servants were naturally more available and morally flexible than their social equals. The idea that a maid might have the same right to refuse unwanted advances as a lady would have struck them as absurd. Your employment contract, such as it is, provides no protections against this kind of treatment. There are no harassment policies, no reporting procedures, no consequences for employers or their guests who abuse their positions of power. You're completely dependent on the goodwill of people who have demonstrated that they don't consider your comfort, safety, or dignity to be significant concerns. The situation with Mr. Hartwell would continue escalating because he has no reason to stop, and you have no way to make him stop. Each day would bring new incidents, each more invasive than the last, as he tests your boundaries and discovers that you effectively have no boundaries because you have no power to enforce them. You develop hypervigilance, constantly watching for signs of his presence, planning escape routes from rooms, and trying to arrange your schedule to avoid being alone with him. The psychological stress would affect your ability to perform other duties, which would result in criticism and punishment for declining work quality. The sleep deprivation would worsen as anxiety made rest impossible. You'd lie awake worrying about tomorrow's interactions, replaying today's uncomfortable moments and trying to develop strategies for situations that have no good solutions. The constant stress would affect your physical health, your emotional stability, and your ability to think clearly about an already complicated situation. Modern people would seek help from law enforcement, report the behavior to higher authorities, or simply quit and find other employment. Victorian servants had none of those options. The police wouldn't take their complaints seriously. There were no higher authorities who would intervene on behalf of servants against their employers, and quitting would mean losing income, housing, and references needed for future employment. The trap was perfect and inescapable. You'd be forced to navigate an increasingly dangerous situation with no protection, no recourse, and no realistic hope that anyone would intervene on your behalf. The stress would be compounded by the knowledge that whatever happened would be considered your responsibility, your failure, your moral weakness. The psychological damage would be permanent. Even if Mr. Hartwell eventually lost interest or left the household, you'd be left with the understanding that your safety and dignity were completely dependent on the whims of people who considered you expendable. The trauma would affect your ability to trust employers, interact naturally with household members, and maintain any sense of personal security. But the harassment situation, terrifying as it was, represented just one facet of a larger problem with Victorian servant life. The complete powerlessness that made sexual exploitation possible also made every other form of abuse inevitable. You weren't just vulnerable to unwanted advances, you were vulnerable to every form of mistreatment that creative minds could devise. And speaking of creative minds, the Victorian upper classes had developed remarkable talents for finding new ways to make servants miserable. One of their most sophisticated techniques involved turning servants against each other through elaborate systems of gossip, reporting, and manufactured conflict. Because if you thought being powerless against your employers was difficult, wait until you discover that you're also completely vulnerable to sabotage from your fellow servants, who have been systematically encouraged to view each other as competitors rather than allies in shared misery. The household hierarchy wasn't just about organizing work, it was about ensuring that servants would police each other more effectively than any external authority ever could. And you're about to learn that lesson in the most personally devastating way possible. 14. You definitely gossip and instantly regret it. You're peeling potatoes with Sarah, the scullery maid, and for the first time in weeks you're actually talking to another human being about something other than proper dusting techniques or the appropriate way to arrange Lady Pemberton's breakfast tray. The conversation feels almost normal, almost like the kind of casual chat you might have with a coworker in any reasonable workplace. Sarah mentions that Master Edward has been particularly difficult lately, staying out until all hours and expecting his muddy boots to be cleaned without complaint. You agree that his behavior has become increasingly inconsistent and unreasonable. She adds that Lady Pemberton seems to be taking out her frustrations on the staff. You observe that the entire household seems more tense than usual. It's a perfectly normal conversation between two people sharing similar work experiences. The kind of discussion that happens in every workplace in the world when employees compare notes about difficult management. Nothing malicious, nothing inappropriate, just two tired people finding comfort in mutual understanding. You have no idea that you've just signed your professional death warrant. Because Sarah isn't just making conversation, she's conducting reconnaissance. The seemingly innocent chat about working conditions is actually an intelligence-gathering operation designed to identify servants with insufficiently grateful attitudes toward their employers. And you've just provided enough material to destroy your employment prospects permanently. Victorian households operated sophisticated surveillance networks that would make intelligence agencies proud. Every servant was encouraged to monitor every other servant for signs of disloyalty, ingratitude, or inappropriate attitudes. The system created an atmosphere of constant suspicion where casual conversation became potential evidence of character flaws. Sarah's friendly demeanor masks a calculating mind that views your complaints as valuable currency in the household's complex economy of information trading. Reporting your dissatisfaction to the housekeeper will demonstrate her own loyalty, while simultaneously eliminating a potential competitor for advancement. It's brilliant strategy disguised as workplace gossip. The Victorian domestic hierarchy was specifically designed to pit servants against each other, rather than encouraging solidarity against shared oppression. Advancement opportunities were deliberately limited, creating intense competition for the few available positions that offered slightly better treatment or marginally higher wages. The housekeeper actively cultivated informants among the staff, rewarding servants who reported on their colleagues with small privileges and subtle favoritism. A servant who demonstrated reliable loyalty by exposing others' disloyalty might earn an extra day off, better food, or consideration for promotion when positions became available. Sarah has been carefully building her reputation as a trustworthy informant through strategic betrayals of fellow servants. Your innocent conversation about working conditions represents another opportunity to demonstrate her value to management while eliminating someone who might eventually compete for her position. The reporting system is so institutionalized that servants develop elaborate codes for discussing their circumstances without technically violating loyalty expectations. Conversations become exercises in diplomatic doublespeak, where everyone understands the subtext, but nobody says anything that could be directly quoted as criticism. Modern people would recognize this as toxic workplace culture, taken to psychotic extremes. The idea that casual conversation with co-workers could be used as evidence of professional misconduct would strike us as genuinely Orwellian. We understand that employees have the right to discuss working conditions without fear of retaliation. But Victorian servants operated under constant surveillance that made privacy impossible and authentic communication dangerous. Every interaction was potentially monitored, every comment potentially reported, every expression of dissatisfaction potentially career-ending. The genius of the system was that it made servants complicit in their own oppression. Instead of uniting against unreasonable working conditions, they competed to demonstrate their superior loyalty by exposing each other's insufficient gratitude. The divide and conquer strategy was so effective that servant solidarity became virtually impossible. Your conversation with Sarah will be reported to the housekeeper within hours, probably embellished with additional details that make your comments sound more inflammatory than they actually were. The housekeeper will share the information with Lady Pemberton as evidence of proper household management and vigilant staff supervision. By evening, you'll be summoned for a formal disciplinary meeting where your attitude and character will be thoroughly dissected. The conversation will be presented as evidence of ingratitude, disloyalty, and poor judgment. Your attempts to explain the context will be dismissed as excuses and further evidence of inappropriate behavior. The psychological impact would be devastating. Discovering that a colleague you trusted was actually monitoring you for management creates profound paranoia and social isolation. You'd never again feel safe having casual conversations with fellow servants. Never trust anyone's apparently friendly overtures. Never relax your guard during supposedly informal interactions. The betrayal cuts deeper because you genuinely liked Sarah and believed she understood your situation. Learning that she was calculating how to use your friendship against you would destroy your ability to form authentic relationships with anyone in the household. The loneliness would become crushing and permanent. Modern people would quit immediately after such a betrayal. We'd recognize the toxic environment and seek employment elsewhere rather than continuing to work in a place where colleagues were actively sabotaging each other. Victorian servants couldn't afford that luxury. The aftermath would be swift and thorough. Your reputation within the household would be permanently damaged. Other servants would avoid association with someone who'd been marked as disloyal. Your working conditions would deteriorate as supervisors watched for additional signs of poor attitude. The punishment might include reduced wages, elimination of privileges, assignment to more unpleasant duties, or formal warnings that would affect future employment references. The goal wasn't just to correct your behavior, but to make an example that would discourage similar indiscretions by other staff members. You'd be forced to continue working alongside Sarah while knowing that she'd deliberately betrayed your trust for personal advancement. The psychological strain of maintaining professional relationships with someone who demonstrated active hostility would be enormous. Every interaction would be tainted by the knowledge that friendly conversation was actually strategic manipulation. The paranoia would spread to all your relationships. If Sarah could betray you so easily, what about the cook who sometimes seemed sympathetic? What about the stable boy who occasionally shared jokes? What about any servant who showed the slightest friendliness? You'd become suspicious of everyone, isolated in a household full of people experiencing identical circumstances, but unable to acknowledge their shared misery. The reporting system created a psychological prison where authentic human connection became impossible. Servants learned to suppress not just complaints about working conditions, but any genuine emotion or opinion that might be interpreted as inappropriate. Conversations were reduced to approved topics discussed in approved ways with approved attitudes. The social isolation would compound the physical exhaustion and psychological stress of the work itself. Humans need genuine connection with others to maintain mental health, but the Victorian Servant surveillance system made such connection impossibly dangerous. You'd be surrounded by people while experiencing profound loneliness. But just when you thought the betrayal by fellow servants was the final cruelty in an already impossible situation, just when you'd learned to trust no one and expect nothing from human relationships, you'd discover that all of this psychological torture was actually just the setup for the ultimate realization about Victorian servant life. Because everything you've experienced, the impossible work, the starvation wages, the constant surveillance, the systematic humiliation, all of it was designed to communicate one fundamental message about your place in the world. And that message, when you finally understood it completely, would be more devastating than any individual cruelty you'd endured. 15. You'd realize you're a background prop in someone else's life. The revelation hits you on a Tuesday morning while you're standing in the corner of the drawing room, waiting to serve tea to Lady Pemberton and her guests. You've been motionless for 45 minutes, holding a silver tray that's getting heavier by the second, while they discuss the latest society gossip, as if you weren't there. Because to them, you aren't there. Not really. You're no more present in their consciousness than the wallpaper, or the furniture, or the decorative vase on the mantelpiece. You're a functional object that occasionally moves and responds to commands, but you're not a person with thoughts, feelings, or any meaningful existence beyond your utility to their comfort. The conversation flows around you like water around a stone. They discuss intimate family matters, personal scandals, and private concerns with complete freedom, because your presence doesn't require any discretion. You're not a person who might repeat what they say or form opinions about their behavior. You're just part of the room's furnishings, temporarily animate but fundamentally irrelevant. Lady Pemberton mentions her daughter's romantic disappointments, her son's gambling debts, and her husband's business failures with the same casual openness she might display if she were alone. The guests contribute their own gossip about mutual acquaintances, financial troubles, and family secrets. None of them consider that you might be listening, because people don't listen, only people listen, and you're not people. Modern humans cannot comprehend this level of dehumanization. We're accustomed to being acknowledged as individuals, even in service roles. Waiters, store clerks, and delivery drivers are treated as people performing jobs, not as mobile furniture that happens to be able to follow instructions. The idea that someone could be so thoroughly dismissed as a human being would strike us as genuinely disturbing. But Victorian society had perfected the art of selective blindness. The upper classes developed the ability to completely ignore the humanity of anyone who served them, treating servants as they might treat well-trained animals. Useful, sometimes requiring management, but never deserving of the consideration reserved for actual people. You realize that in 3 months of employment, no one has ever asked your opinion about anything. No one has inquired about your background, your family, your interests, or your aspirations. No one has expressed curiosity about your thoughts or feelings. You've been treated as a collection of useful functions rather than a human being with an interior life. The conversations you've overheard reveal that the family knows nothing about you beyond your capacity to perform assigned tasks. They don't know your age, your hometown, your family situation, or any other detail that might suggest you have an existence independent of their household. You're not a person who happens to work for them. You're a service that happens to be provided by something that looks like a person. Your name is rarely used. You're usually referred to as the maid or the girl, or simply addressed through commands that don't require names. When they do use your name, it's in the same tone they might use to call a dog or summon a taxi. It's a functional identifier, not a recognition of your individual identity. The psychological impact is devastating. Being treated as invisible while remaining physically present creates a form of existential crisis that modern people can barely imagine. You're simultaneously hypervisible, every movement monitored, every mistake noted, and completely invisible as a human being worthy of basic acknowledgement. You watch Lady Pemberton worry about her son's future, her daughter's happiness, and her husband's health with genuine maternal and spousal concern. She's capable of deep empathy and emotional connection. But those capacities are reserved exclusively for people she considers worthy of such recognition. You're simply not in that category. The guests demonstrate similar selective humanity. They show concern for each other's welfare, interest in each other's opinions, and respect for each other's feelings. They're not cruel or sociopathic people. They're simply operating within a social system that has trained them to recognize some humans as fully human, while dismissing others as barely sentient. You begin to understand that your entire existence has been reduced to a collection of functions. You're not a person who cleans, you're a cleaning function that happens to be mobile. You're not a person who serves food, you're a food service mechanism that occasionally requires maintenance. Your thoughts, dreams, fears, and aspirations are as irrelevant as the mechanical processes inside a clock. The realization is more crushing than any individual cruelty you've experienced. Being screamed at for mistakes at least acknowledges that you're capable of making mistakes, which implies some level of agency and consciousness. Being treated as completely invisible suggests that you're not even significant enough to deserve mistreatment. Modern people would recognize this as psychological abuse of the most sophisticated kind. The systematic denial of personhood, the refusal to acknowledge basic humanity, the treatment of human beings as functional objects. All of this would be considered profoundly damaging to mental health and personal dignity. But Victorian society considered this treatment not just acceptable, but morally necessary. Acknowledging servants as full human beings would compromise the social hierarchy that made their labor possible. The system required that servants be simultaneously human enough to perform complex tasks and inhuman enough to accept degrading treatment without complaint. You realize that your breaking point isn't going to come from overwork, malnutrition, or abuse. It's going to come from the gradual erosion of your sense of self, under the constant message that you don't matter, your thoughts don't count, and your existence is significant only to the extent that it serves other people's comfort. The most devastating aspect is that the system works. After months of being treated as invisible, you start to feel invisible. After being dismissed as irrelevant, you begin to question whether your thoughts and feelings are actually important. After being reduced to a collection of functions, you start to lose track of who you are beyond those functions. Modern people would seek therapy, join support groups, or find ways to maintain their sense of individual worth despite degrading treatment. Victorian servants had no such resources. They were expected to internalize their dehumanization so completely that they genuinely believed their treatment was appropriate and their reduced status was natural. The psychological conditioning was so thorough that many servants developed genuine gratitude for their dehumanization. They convinced themselves that being treated as invisible was actually a form of trust and respect. They interpreted their employer's indifference as professional courtesy rather than existential dismissal. You watch yourself disappearing, piece by piece, day by day. Your opinions become less certain. Your personality becomes more muted. Your sense of individual worth becomes increasingly tenuous. You're not being destroyed dramatically, you're being erased gradually, systematically, almost gently. The process is so subtle that you might not notice it happening until it's too late. One day you'll realize that you've stopped having opinions about things that don't directly relate to your work. You'll discover that you no longer think about your future, your dreams, or your desires. You'll find that you've become exactly what the system wanted you to become, a perfectly functional human appliance, grateful for the opportunity to serve, and completely empty of any inconvenient personhood. And the most horrifying part, you'll be thankful for it, because the alternative, maintaining your humanity, while being constantly reminded that it doesn't matter, is too painful to endure. It's easier to become invisible than to remain visible while being ignored. Modern people reading this might feel outrage, sympathy, or disbelief, but they should also feel gratitude, because every labor law, every workplace protection, every social safety net that prevents this kind of systematic dehumanization exists because people recognized that treating human beings like disposable objects was not just cruel, but fundamentally wrong. The Victorian servant system wasn't an aberration or a historical curiosity. It was the logical endpoint of a social philosophy that valued some people's comfort above other people's humanity. And it serves as a permanent reminder of what happens when society decides that some human beings simply don't matter as much as others.